People always assume being a park ranger means hiking trails and saving baby deer. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it means standing in a sea of fog at 2 a.m. in the heart of the Whispering Hollows and knowing, with every fiber of your being, that you are not alone. The incident happened in 2019 in the northern reaches of the Shadalpine Mountains, a range I'll keep nameless. Not to protect the people, to protect you. Because if you know the name, you might try to find it. And I promise, you don't want to. The locals who've lived in the shadow of those peaks for generations have their own names for certain places. Names they whisper only when they have to. Names that make children pull their blankets tighter. The fog started rolling in around midnight, creeping down from the Devil's Crown, the highest peak in the range, where the treeline dies and only bare rock reaches toward the sky like gnarled fingers. I was stationed in a temporary outpost with 3 others. Sam, the veteran whose 20-year career had weathered everything from avalanches to bear attacks. Ellie, the medic whose steady hands had pulled more than one hiker back from death's door. And Carter, the new kid fresh from the academy, still believing the worst thing he'd faced was a twisted ankle or a bee sting. We were assisting with a backcountry search for a missing hiker deep in the Morning Valley, a place that earned its name from the way the wind sounds when it moves through the narrow canyon walls. A solo camper, female, 28, had vanished 3 days prior after texting a friend from somewhere near Sorrows Ridge. "There's something wrong with the mist." Those were her exact words. Her last words. We laughed at first, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves everything is normal. Probably just disoriented. Happens all the time up in the hollows. That thin air plays tricks on your mind. But then the radio started failing, cutting out mid-sentence, filling with static that sounded almost like whispers. And the fog didn't lift. It never lifted. We were spread out over about 3 miles of the Serpent's Path, an ancient trail that wound through the valley like a snake's spine, following the contours of a land that seemed designed by something other than nature. Visibility dropped to near zero within minutes, as if the fog had rushed in with purpose, so we bunkered down in place until morning. I was posted at a ridgeline known as the Bone Garden, named for the jagged rocks that jutted from the earth like the ribs of some massive, buried creature, their pale surfaces gleaming even in darkness. The air up there felt different. Thicker. Wrong. Like breathing through wet cloth. Around 2:13 a.m., my radio crackled to life. I expected Ellie's voice checking in from her position down at Weeping Stone, or maybe Sam from his post at the Crow's Perch. But what I heard was wrong. It was distorted. Half whisper, half static. But I swear on my life I heard my name. Over and over, like a prayer or a summoning. Jason. Jason, come in. But it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the fog itself, from somewhere out there in the gray void beyond my tent. I stepped outside into the suffocating embrace of the mist, and the world had disappeared. No trees, no stars, no sound except the steady drip of condensation that seemed to fall upward. The fog here wasn't like any natural phenomenon I'd encountered in 2 decades of wilderness work. It moved with intention, curling and writhing like something alive, something aware. Just pale white everywhere, dense enough to cut. And a shape. Moving. It didn't move like a person or any animal I'd ever tracked through these mountains. It pulsed, warped, shifted like smoke given form and malicious purpose. Every time I blinked, it was closer, as if my closed eyes were an invitation, a momentary doorway it could slip through. Still foggy, no detail, just motion that defied every law of nature I thought I understood. I called out, my voice swallowed by the unnatural silence. "Who's there?" It stopped. Dead still, like a predator that had just spotted its prey. Then it answered in my voice. Perfect pitch, perfect cadence, perfect terror. "Who's there?" Identical tone, identical inflection. Like an echo, but not delayed. It was simultaneous, as if the thing had reached inside my throat and stolen the words as I spoke them. I backed up to the tent, hand trembling as I reached for the flare gun on my belt. The metal felt ice cold, as if the fog had already begun claiming it. The shape moved again, this time to my left, toward the edge of the bone garden where the rocks dropped away into the abyss, a chasm so deep locals claimed you could drop a stone and never hear it hit bottom. But I never saw it move. It just wasn't in front of me anymore, like it had simply edited itself from one position to another. I'll fire the flare. The red glow lit the fog like blood and milk, casting writhing shadows that danced and twisted in ways shadows should never move. There was nothing there. No figure. No trees. No anything but the endless, hungry white. And then I saw it briefly in that dying crimson light. A silhouette, suspended in the glow like it was trapped behind a thin membrane between worlds. Not a man. Not a bear. Not anything that should exist in the realm of the living. Something in between. Something wrong. Arms too long, reaching almost to what might have been knees. No face. Just a blank surface where features should be, smooth as river stone and twice as cold. It raised one arm. Not like a wave. Like a warning. Or maybe a promise. Then the flare died, plunging the bone garden back into its suffocating gray embrace. And it was gone. But I could feel it watching. Waiting. Learning. The next morning brought no sunrise to the morning valley, just a gradual lightening of the gray that surrounded us like a cocoon. I radioed the others and told them I was moving base camp away from the bone garden. I didn't give details about what I'd seen in the dying flare light. Just said I felt unsafe, that something about the ridge didn't sit right. Carter joked about ghosts in the mist, his voice cracking slightly over the radio. What's next? Jason. Bigfoot down at Phantom Creek. But when I found him an hour later at the junction of Sorrow's Path and the Devil's Staircase, a treacherous series of switchbacks carved into the mountain face, he was sitting on a moss-covered boulder, shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. He didn't say a word for 10 minutes, just stare into the fog with eyes that had seen too much too fast. Then he whispered, barely audible above the oppressive silence. It copied me. That was all. Just 3 words that carried the weight of a shattered worldview. Copied him. He refused to walk through the fog anymore, claiming it was listening to every step, every breath, every heartbeat. We had to lead him by hand like a blind man through terrain he'd studied on maps for weeks, past landmarks that no longer seemed to exist in this gray limbo. Ellie stayed behind at the Weeping Stone to comfort him while I pushed ahead toward the Shadowmere Basin where the missing hiker's GPS had last pinged. The fog seemed to part reluctantly before me, as if it resented my intrusion into its domain. And that's when I found something I'll never unsee, something that redefined my understanding of what was possible in this world. Boot. Just one. Hiking boot. Expensive, barely worn. Still tied in a perfect bow. Upright in the moss beside the grief pool, small, perfectly circular tarn that reflected nothing, not even the gray sky above. 10 feet away, partially hidden beneath a cluster of deathcap mushrooms, a foot inside it. No blood. No sign of struggle. No torn fabric or scattered belongings. Just a clean sever at the ankle, like it had been melted away by something that dissolved flesh but left bone and leather untouched. And something etched in the damp earth beside it, carved with what looked like a fingernail, but was far too deep, far too precise. You are not you. I backed away from the grief pool, suddenly aware that the fog wasn't just weather, wasn't some atmospheric anomaly caused by temperature differentials and barometric pressure. It was alive. It wasn't there to hide something. It was the thing, the hunter, the collector of voices and faces and whatever else it needed to wear our skins. That night, we made camp in a hollow called the Sanctuary, a cruel name for a place that offered no sanctuary at all, just a ring of dead trees whose bark had turned bone white years ago. Carter disappeared sometime during the witching hour, when the fog grew thick enough to chew. We'd posted watches in overlapping shifts. He was sleeping between Ellie and me, zipped into his sleeping bag with only the top of his head visible. I checked on him at 2:47 a.m., heard his steady breathing, saw the rise and fall of the fabric. But when I blinked, just blinked around 3 a.m., he was gone. No sounds of struggle. No zipper being opened. No footsteps on the carpet of dead leaves. Just an empty sleeping bag, still warm, still holding the impression of his body like a death shroud. And no footprints leading away from the camp, as if he'd simply evaporated into the hungry mist. The fog began curling in tighter, sliding between the white trees like searching fingers, probing, testing, tasting the air around our pathetic little camp. It moved with purpose now, no longer pretending to be natural, no longer hiding its intelligence behind the mask of weather. Ellie started crying. Not loud, hysterical sobs, but quiet, hopeless tears that she tried to muffle against her jacket sleeve. Like she didn't want it to hear, didn't want to attract the attention of whatever had taken Carter into the endless gray. We sat back to back with knives in our hands, useless steel against something that could steal voices and dissolve flesh, and waited for morning in the sanctuary that offered no sanctuary at all. But morning never came. The fog didn't lift. It didn't thin or retreat or show any sign of the natural cycle we'd relied on our entire careers. It stayed gray, stayed heavy, stayed wrong, like the sun had forgotten how to rise, or maybe the thing in the fog had simply eaten it. Day 4 in the gray limbo of the Shadow-Pine Mountains. We were down to protein bars and water, our supplies dwindling as fast as our sanity. The fog had become our world, our prison, our slow-motion tomb. No one was talking anymore. Words seemed dangerous here, liable to be stolen and turned against us by whatever intelligence moved through the mist. We communicated in gestures and glances, like survivors in a war zone where sound mid-death. We hiked toward the GPS marker where the missing hiker's phone had last pinged, somewhere deep in the hollow of lost voices, a depression in the valley floor where locals claimed you could hear the final words of everyone who'd ever died in these mountains. The fog grew thicker as we descended, until we were moving through something that felt more like liquid than air, something that clung to our skin and clothes and hair with greedy fingers. We found her at the heart of the hollow, beside a pool of black water that reflected nothing. Sort of found her. She was sitting upright against a tree whose bark had turned to stone, eyes open and staring at something we couldn't see. Still breathing, chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm, but not blinking, not responding, not human anymore, not in any way that mattered. Mouth hanging open like she just started to scream and forgot how, or maybe something had stolen the sound before it could escape. And around her, fog. The thickest we'd seen, so dense it seemed almost solid. Almost oily, with an iridescent sheen that caught no light because there was no light to catch. Ellie reached out to touch her, some instinct of compassion overriding the terror that had kept us alive this long. And the girl blinked. Once, slow, deliberate, then whispered in Ellie's voice, in Ellie's exact tone and cadence. There's something wrong with the mist. We ran. We didn't stop until we collapsed miles away, lungs burning, hearts hammering, minds fracturing under the weight of what we'd witnessed in the hollow of lost voices. I don't remember how we got out of the Shadow-Pine Mountains, how we escaped the gray prison that had held us for 4 days. 1 second we were choking on fog thick as quicksand, ears ringing with voices not our own. Carter's laugh, the missing hiker's last words, our own voices twisted into threats and promises. The fog whispered secrets in languages that predated human speech, shared truths that would have driven us mad if we'd understood them. Then sunlight. Real sunlight, warm and golden and impossibly bright after so long in the gray. Blue sky stretched overhead like a miracle, like a promise that the world still existed beyond the hungry mist. Blessed silence. No whispers, no stolen voices, no sound of something vast and patient breathing just beyond sight. No fog, just clean mountain air and the distant call of a hawk circling high above the peaks. Just a ranger vehicle on the roadside at the mouth of Despair Canyon, its lights flashing red and blue like beacons guiding us back to a world we'd almost forgotten existed. We didn't speak during the ride back to civilization. Didn't speak during the debrief with officials who took notes and nodded and wrote everything off as altitude sickness and stress-induced hallucinations. Didn't speak for weeks, afraid that opening our mouths might let something out, something we'd carried back from the hollow of lost voices. The official report filed away in some bureaucratic cabinet says weather anomaly, temporary disorientation due to atmospheric pressure changes in the Shadalpine Range. Mass hallucination brought on by altitude and exhaustion. But I know what I saw in the bone garden, in the sanctuary, in the hollow of lost voices. I know what lives in the fog that rolls down from Devil's Crown on certain nights, when the temperature drops and the air grows still and hungry. Ellie quit the service 2 weeks after our return. Last I heard, she'd moved to Arizona, about as far from mountains and mist as you can get in this country. Carter transferred to a desk job in Phoenix. Sends me a Christmas card every year with nothing written inside but his name, as if he's forgotten how to form words that might be stolen and used against him. And me? I kept the boot. Not as a trophy or some morbid keepsake. As a reminder that there are things in this world that wear our faces and speak with our voices and remember our names long after we've forgotten them ourselves. Because one night, just last week, no wind, no weather warnings, no natural explanation, fog rolled in outside my house in the valley below the Shadalpine Mountains. No clouds, no humidity, just a creeping wall of gray swallowing the street like a living thing, like something that had followed me home from the hollow of lost voices. And in the silence that followed, in that unnatural quiet that I'd learned to fear more than any storm, 3 words scratched into my back window, written in the condensation that shouldn't have been there. You found me, but I know the truth now, the secret the fog whispered in the moments before we escaped its gray embrace. I didn't find it. It found me, and it's been waiting ever since, patient as stone, hungry as winter, for me to come back to the bone garden where this all began. Sometimes, on foggy nights, I can hear it calling my name from somewhere beyond the veil of mist. In my own voice. Perfect pitch. Perfect terror. And I know that someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now, I'll answer. Because the thing in the fog doesn't just copy voices. It collects them. And it's not done with me yet. You'll hear things. Just stay grounded. I nodded like I understood. But I didn't. Not until the 4th night at Blackmore Ridge. The first few days were easy, peaceful, even. I'd sit in a tower overlooking the vast expanse of Thornwick Forest, my binoculars cutting through the morning mist that clung to the valley like desperate fingers. The ancient pines stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their tops disappearing into low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down on the world with an unnatural weight. I'd scan for smoke, log temperatures that always seemed 3 degrees colder than they should be, make notes about wildlife movement that grew sparser with each passing day. The tower creaked when the wind hit it just right, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo from somewhere deep beneath the earth. But I got used to it. You learn to ignore the groans of wood and wind, the way the metal joints sang in frequencies that made your teeth ache. What you don't learn to ignore is the feeling that the forest itself is listening to every sound you make. The trouble started when I saw the figure at Widow's Drop. It was around sunset, when the light took on that sickly amber quality that made everything look jaundiced. I was finishing a sketch of a fox I'd seen near the base, the first animal I'd spotted in 2 days, when I looked up and there it was. A person. Standing at the edge of the tree line where the forest met the rocky outcropping known as Widow's Drop. Far below, at least 200 feet down the sheer cliff face. Motionless as the standing stones that dotted the ridge. I lifted the binoculars with trembling hands, though I didn't understand why they shook. Black hoodie that seemed to absorb what little light remained. Pale skin that looked almost luminescent in the dying light. Couldn't see the face, it was lost in shadow, so deep it seemed solid. They were just standing there, as still as death, as if they'd been carved from the very stone of the cliff. The silence was absolute. Even the ever-present wind had died, leaving the forest in a vacuum of sound that made my ears ring. I could hear my own heartbeat, thunderous in the quiet, and the sound of my breathing seemed to echo back from the trees below. I radioed down to Greystone Base Station, my voice cracking the oppressive silence like a gunshot. Got someone wandering near the southeast perimeter, near Widow's Drop. Possible lost hiker. Static filled the air, harsh and grating, before a voice emerged through the white noise. Copy that. No public access on Widow's Drop, Rich. You sure about the location? Affirmative. They're just standing there. A longer pause. When the voice returned, it carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. Stay in the tower. We'll send a team to check Deadfall Gorge in the morning. Don't engage. Deadfall Gorge. That's what they called the area below Widow's Drop, where the broken trees accumulated like bones in a charnel house. I'd seen it on the maps, but never from this angle. The name suddenly seemed more ominous. That was fine with me. When I looked again, lowering the binoculars and raising them once more, the figure was gone. Not walked off. Not faded into the growing darkness. Just as if it had never been there at all, leaving me to wonder if the isolation was already playing tricks with my mind. That night, as darkness settled over Thornwick Forest like a suffocating blanket, the noises began. Knocking. Soft, deliberate, rhythmic. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. On the wooden stilts beneath the tower, each impact sending vibrations up through the structure and into my bones. I leaned out over the railing, my flashlight cutting a weak cone of light through the absolute darkness. The beams seemed to be swallowed by the night, reaching only a few feet before disappearing entirely. Nothing moved in that pathetic circle of illumination. Just the gnarled roots of ancient pines and the scattered debris of decades of windfall. Then a whisper, barely audible above the resumed wind, too high. The voice seemed to come from directly below me, yet when I swept the flashlight across the ground, there was nothing. Nothing but shadows that seemed to writhe and shift just outside the beam's reach. It was so faint I wasn't even sure I'd heard it, but it burrowed into my mind like a parasite. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window, rifle across my knees, watching the darkness and listening to sounds that might have been wind, might have been animals, might have been something else entirely. Every creak of the tower, every rustle in the canopy below, every distant call of a night bird made me jump. The next day brought no relief. I double-checked the area around Widow's Drop with binoculars, scanning every inch of Deadfall Gorge and the surrounding forest. Nothing unusual, just the same oppressive canopy of pines and the occasional glimpse of the creek that wound through the valley like a silver scar. But the air felt heavier somehow, thick and oppressive, like a storm was coming, even though the sky remained a blank, colorless gray. At noon, I climbed down from my perch and walked the short trail that looped around the base of the tower through what the maps called Whisperwood Grove. The ancient trees here grew, so close together their branches intertwined overhead, creating a natural tunnel that blocked out most of the sky. Animal prints dotted the soft earth, some deer, a few raccoons, the distinctive paw prints of a fox. Nothing else. Nothing human. But the silence was wrong. In a healthy forest, there should be birdsong, the rustle of small animals, the drone of insects. Here, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant sound of water over stone. Then I saw the marks. On one of the support beams, someone had carved symbols with brutal precision. Deep, jagged lines, like a knife or sharp rock, had done the work with savage intensity. The cuts were fresh, whitewood showing through the weathered exterior, sap still weeping from the wounds. 3 eyes arranged in a triangle. A circle surrounding them, and a single word scratched beneath in letters that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, watching. My hand shook as I photographed the carvings. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe in the camera's viewfinder, as if they were alive, as if they were looking back at me through the lens. I reported it to Greystone Base Station. The radio crackled with static, then silence. No response, just the empty hiss of dead air. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and plunged Thornwick Forest into premature darkness, I tried to sleep again. and the knocking came back. But this time it was different. Louder, angrier, like fists slamming against the tower legs with increasing fury. The entire structure shook with each impact, the metal joints screaming in protest. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the pounding grew more violent, more desperate. I grabbed my rifle and spotlight, hands slick with cold sweat, swung the powerful beam down through the trapdoor. No one. The circle of light revealed nothing but empty air and the forest floor 20 feet below. But the pounding continued, as if invisible fists were hammering against wood and metal, as if something was trying to shake me out of the sky like fruit from a tree. But then the voice returned, clearer now, carrying up from the darkness with crystal clarity. "You're in my seat." It was right below me, just out of sight of even the spotlight's penetrating beam. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was hollow, empty, like wind through a cave, like the sound of something that had forgotten how to be human. I didn't move the rest of the night. I sat frozen in that chair, rifle trained on the trapdoor, spotlight clutched in my white-knuckled grip, listening to the intermittent knocking and that terrible voice whispering things I couldn't quite make out but somehow understood. Words about darkness and watching, and the price of climbing too high. By day 7, I was unraveling like a rope under strain. The radio went dead completely. No static, no white noise, just the hollow silence of broken technology. I checked the connections, changed the batteries, adjusted the antenna. Nothing. It was as if the forest itself was interfering with the signal, as if something wanted me isolated, cut off from the world beyond Thornwick Forest. No response from Greystone Base Station. No check-ins. No supply drops. For all intents and purposes, I had ceased to exist. I climbed higher onto the roof of the tower, thinking maybe I'd get better signal from the array mounted there. The wind was stronger up here, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and wrong. That's when I saw it again. The figure. Standing in Moonfall Clearing, a small meadow roughly half a mile north of the tower, where the trees formed a perfect circle around a patch of dead grass. But this time it looked wrong. Taller than before, impossibly tall, as if its bones had been stretched on some medieval rack. Limbs slightly too long, joints bending at angles that made my eyes water to look at. Like someone wearing a human suit that didn't quite fit, that had been tailored by something that had only heard humans described secondhand. The hoodie hung stiffly, as if it were draped over a scarecrow's frame, and where its face should have been. Just shadow. Not darkness, not the absence of light, but shadow with substance and weight, shadow that seemed to move independently of any light source. I shouted across the distance, my voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. "Who are you?" It didn't answer with words. Instead, it tilted its head too far, like an owl, like something whose neck wasn't constrained by human limitations. And then it raised one arm, the movement jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer, and pointed up at me, at the tower, at my perch in the sky. The gesture seemed to last forever, that accusing finger extended toward me like a condemnation. And in that moment, I understood with perfect, terrible clarity that I was the intruder here. I was the one who didn't belong. I was the one being watched. I barricaded the hatch that night like a man preparing for siege, pushed the desk and the cot over it, stacked everything I could move into a makeshift fortress. Sat in the corner with my rifle aimed at the trapdoor, finger on the trigger, safety off. The metal was cold against my cheek as I sighted down the barrel at the wooden barrier that separated me from whatever was climbing up from below. Around 2 a.m., when the darkness was absolute and the silence was complete, the trapdoor thudded. Once, twice, then creaked, like someone was leaning into it, testing its strength. The wood groaned under pressure that shouldn't exist. No one could be standing on that ladder, not with the way the sound reverberated through the structure. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I stared at that barrier of furniture and wood and willed it to hold. Then something said, clear as day, from behind the hatch, from just on the other side of my pathetic barricade. "You're not alone." The voice was different this time. Not hollow, not empty. It was warm, familiar, almost comforting. It sounded like someone I should know, someone I trusted, someone who cared about me. It took me a moment to realize why the voice was so disturbing. It was my own voice, speaking to me from the other side of the door. I don't remember passing out, but I woke up with my rifle across my chest, the desk still in place, weak daylight filtering through the dirty windows. My body ached from sleeping on the hard floor, my neck stiff from the awkward position. The trapdoor. It was open, not just unlocked. Open. The heavy wooden hatch stood vertical, revealing the ladder descending into shadow. My barricade was undisturbed, desk, cot, everything exactly where I'd placed it. But somehow impossibly, the door had opened from below without moving any of the furniture. I descended the tower at first light, legs shaking so badly I nearly fell twice. Ran the 2 miles to Greystone Bay Station through Raven's Hollow Trail, a narrow path that wound between standing stones and ancient burial mounds. Completely off schedule. Covered in sweat despite the morning chill. Dirt under my fingernails from clawing at the furniture. I must have looked insane, wild-eyed and babbling about voices and figures and impossible geometry. They found me a replacement within hours. Said I was dehydrated, that the altitude and isolation had gotten to me. Early signs of isolation-induced psychosis, the report would later read. Classic case. Happened to tower watchers more often than the service liked to admit. But one of the senior rangers pulled me aside later, away from the others, into the shadow of the equipment shed. Quietly, almost whispering. "You saw the Hollow Watcher, didn't you?" I stared at him. Mark, his name was, white beard streaked with premature gray, eyes that had seen too many seasons in these mountains. He looked older than his years, worn down by wind and weather and things that didn't appear in official reports. He just nodded when I didn't answer. Thing lives in those woods. Older than this park, older than the trees, older than the stones. Takes the shape of things it's seen, things it's consumed. Consumed. Rangers. Campers. Anyone who spends too long alone in Thornwick Forest. Anyone who climbs too high. He looked me dead in the eye with an intensity that made me want to look away. It hates towers. Says we're watching it, disturbing its domain. That's what the knocking is. It's trying to shake us down, bring us back to ground level where it can reach us. I asked him if they'd ever caught it, ever found proof, ever filed an official report. He shook his head slowly. But sometimes, when a ranger disappears, when someone goes missing in the deep woods, we find carvings. Always the same symbol. 3 eyes. He nodded grimly. And a circle. And one word. I said it with him, our voices joining in grim harmony. Watching. I left Thornwick Forest National Park 2 days later, my resignation processed with unusual speed. No questions asked. No exit interview. Just a handshake and a final paycheck and a suggestion that I might want to find work in a city, somewhere with lots of people and bright lights and no shadows. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night through rural areas and pass a fire tower in the distance, a dark silhouette against the stars, I feel like someone's up there. Not watching the forest for fires. Watching me. I tried to move on, tried to build a new life in places where the tallest structures were office buildings and cell towers, where the darkness was broken by streetlights and neon signs. New job. New state. New identity, almost. I stopped talking about what happened in the tower at Blackmore Ridge, except in whispers to people who didn't laugh. Most did. Those who didn't just stare with a look I'd come to recognize, the look of someone who'd seen something similar, something that couldn't be explained by rational thought or scientific method. I told myself it was just stress, isolation, maybe even hallucination brought on by too much solitude and too little sleep. That's what they said in the report. Sleep deprivation. Early stage cabin fever. Acute stress reaction to prolonged isolation. They let me go quietly. No black marks on my record, just a gentle nudge out the door and into civilian life. But I couldn't forget. It followed me in ways I didn't expect, in ways that made me question whether I'd ever really left Thornwick Forest at all. Flickering shadows at the edge of headlights when I drove at night. Tapping sounds outside my apartment window, 4 stories up, with no fire escape, no way for anyone to be out there. My dreams were always the same, recurring with mechanical precision. Knocking. That voice whispering, "You're in my seat." And always, somewhere in the background of these nocturnal visions, the shape. The watcher. Standing in impossible places, watching from angles that shouldn't exist, its hollow gaze following me through sleeping and waking hours alike. 2 years later, just when I'd begun to convince myself that time and distance had weakened whatever connection I'd forged in that tower, I got a call from Jonah, a ranger buddy from the same district. We'd worked together during my training, shared stories around campfires, complained about the isolation and the bureaucracy, and the way the forest seemed to get into your bones. "Do you still think about that thing from the tower?" I hadn't spoken to him in months, hadn't even thought about him in weeks. But his voice on the phone brought it all back. The smell of pine resin and wood smoke, the weight of binoculars around my neck, the endless vista of green stretching to the horizon. "All the time," I said, surprised by my own honesty. He sighed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "We lost someone." My stomach dropped, that familiar sensation of the world tilting beneath my feet. "Who?" "Cam. Young guy. New transfer from the coast. Took Shadow Peak Tower for a weekend shift during fire season. Never checked out. Radio went dead on the second night. Shadow Peak Tower. I knew it. Another watchtower in the same network, deeper in the forest, more isolated than even Blackmore Ridge. If Thornwick Forest was the mouth of some vast creature, Shadow Peak was its throat. Did anyone go out to check? They found the trapdoor open. Ladder intact. No signs of struggle. The familiar chill ran down my spine, ice water in my veins. And same carvings. Same symbols. Same damn word. I gripped the phone tighter, knuckles wide against the plastic. On the tower, on every tree in a 50-foot radius. Like something had gone mad with a knife, carving the same message over and over until the bark bled sap. I didn't say anything. Neither did he for a long time. Just the sound of our breathing across the connection. 2 men separated by hundreds of miles, but united by an experience that had marked us both. Then, I don't believe it's gone. I don't think it ever leaves those woods. I think it just waits. He hung up without saying goodbye. A week after the call, I started dreaming again. But this time the dreams felt different, more vivid, more real than memory. Like I wasn't just dreaming about the Watcher, like I was seeing through its eyes. Everything tinted gray, drained of color and warmth. Trees moving in unnatural winds that made no sound. Voices echoing from above, distant and distorted. Tower windows glowing faintly at night like fireflies trapped in glass jars. And rage. Cold, ancient rage that had been building for centuries. In these dreams, I understood things I hadn't before. The Watcher wasn't just watching, it was territorial. These forests had been its domain long before humans arrived with their maps and their towers and their need to catalog and control. We were the invaders, the interlopers, the ones who climbed too high and saw too much. It hated us for disturbing the darkness. It hated us for bringing light to places that were meant to remain hidden. But most of all, it hated us for watching. Because in watching, we were taking something from it. Some essential part of the wild, the unknown, the sacred mystery of deep places. Every observation was a theft. Every recorded sighting was a violation. One night, I woke up to knocking. In my apartment. At the door. 3 soft knocks, perfectly spaced, identical to the sounds that had haunted me in the tower. I froze, just like before, just like that night at Blackmore Ridge. Gun in hand, I started keeping one by the bed, bare feet silent on the cold tile. I stepped slowly to the door and looked through the peephole. Empty hallway. No movement. No sound except the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of traffic from the street below. I waited. I pressed to the fisheye lens, watching the distorted view of the corridor. And then something moved, just barely, at the far end of the hallway where the emergency exit cast angular shadows. The lights flickered once, twice, then steady again. And I saw it. A figure. Still as stone. Limbs too long, joints wrong, face lost in that familiar hood. Just standing there in the impossible geometry of the hallway, existing in a space that should have been empty. Watching. I backed away from the door, gun raised but useless. What could bullets do against something that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare? It didn't move from its position by the exit. But I heard the voice again, not through the door this time, but inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. Climb down. It didn't make sense at first. I was already on the ground, already as low as I could go in this vertical city of steel and glass. Then it clicked. It wasn't talking to me in the hallway. It was remembering. Reliving that night in the tower when I barricaded myself in, and it had spoken those words from below. It was still there, somewhere in the deep woods of Thornwick Forest, still trapped in that memory loop, still living that confrontation over and over. And maybe I was still there too, some part of me locked in that moment of terror, unable to fully escape. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had never really left the tower. Part of me was still up there, still watching, still being watched. The distance between my apartment and Blackmore Ridge meant nothing. Space was irrelevant when you were dealing with something that existed outside normal reality. I booked a flight back to the park the next morning. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. Didn't file a plan or inform the authorities. Just showed up at the old ranger station in Millbrook, the same weathered building with its peeling paint and windows that never seemed to catch the light properly. Mark was still there, older now, more gray in his beard, lines deeper around his eyes. But when he looked up from his paperwork and saw me standing in the doorway, he didn't seem surprised. "I knew you'd be back," he said simply. "Come on," I said. "The ranger who disappeared from Shadow Peak Tower." He nodded grimly. "You have the keys." He reached into his desk drawer without hesitation and pulled out a ring of keys, the metal warm as if it had been waiting in his palm. "Tower's been sealed since we found him," he said, placing the keys in my hand. "Or didn't find him, I should say. You think I'm crazy for going back." He shook his head slowly. "I think you're the only one who might have a chance of ending this. It's marked you somehow, connected to you. Maybe that's what it takes." I hiked up alone, following Drakemore Trail, a narrow path that switchbacked up the mountainside through stands of ancient pine and cedar. The forest was even quieter than I remembered, as if the very act of my return had put the woods on alert. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals, just the sound of my boots on stone and pine needles. Didn't bring a radio. I knew it wouldn't work anyway. The Watcher had its own relationship with technology, its own way of isolating its prey. When I reached Shadow Peak Tower, the door was already open. No footprints in the surrounding dirt. No signs of recent visitors. Just that yawning entrance like a mouth waiting to swallow whatever was foolish enough to enter. I climbed slowly, one hand on the railing, one on the keys that I somehow knew I wouldn't need. Each step upward seemed to take me further from the world I understood and deeper into something older and more primal. The higher I got, the heavier the air became, thick with the weight of watching eyes and accumulated dread. At the top, I paused before the final step. The trap door was shut, but not locked. I could feel the presence waiting above, patient as stone, ancient as the mountains themselves. Inside, the place was untouched. Desk positioned precisely where it should be. Cot made with military precision. Lantern filled with oil. Chair by the window, facing out toward the endless expanse of Thornwick Forest. I sat down in it just as I had 2 years ago, just as Cam had before he disappeared, just as countless others had over the decades. And I waited. It came just after midnight, when the darkness was absolute and the silence was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. I didn't hear it arrive, it didn't climb the ladder or force the door. It simply became present, the way shadows deepen when clouds pass over the moon. Then the voice, not hollow this time but warm, familiar, speaking inside my head with perfect clarity. You came back. I stood slowly, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird, and stepped to the hatch. This time, instead of barricading myself in, I reached down and pulled it open. And then, because I was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of leaving parts of myself scattered across impossible landscapes, I spoke. What do you want? It answered without words, downloading its essence directly into my consciousness like water poured into an empty vessel. And I saw it all. Visions that felt more real than memory. The history of this place, stretching back beyond human record. Rangers coming and going like mayflies. Brief flickers of life in the forest's eternal timeline. Generations of watchers climbing towers, scanning horizons, documenting and cataloging and claiming ownership over something that had never belonged to them. And beneath them, always beneath them, something ancient and hollow crawling through root systems and shadow networks, forgotten by time, by maps, by memory itself. A consciousness older than the trees, deeper than the stone, more patient than erosion. They built the towers to watch for danger, to protect the forest from fire and disease and human carelessness. But the danger had always been below. The Watcher wasn't just a creature. It was an immune response. The forest defending itself against invasion, against observation, against the human need to quantify and control. Every tower was a violation. Every watcher was a trespasser. Every recorded observation was a theft of something sacred and wild. It didn't want to hurt us. It wanted us gone. It wanted the forest back. Dark, silent, unwatched. Free to exist in the spaces between human understanding, in the gaps where mystery still lived. I understood then why it had marked me, why it had followed me across states and years and dreams. I wasn't just a witness, I was a participant. By watching it, I had become part of its story. And stories, once begun, demand completion. I see you, I said, and meant it in every possible way. And it screamed. Not a sound that could be heard with ears, but a presence that shattered reality like glass. The tower shuddered, windows cracking in spiderweb patterns. The cot flipped as if struck by invisible hands. My vision blurred as the air itself seemed to fracture. But through it all, I kept looking, kept watching, kept bearing witness to something that had lived in darkness for millennia, something that had never been truly seen until this moment. And in that act of observation, complete, unflinching, accepting, something fundamental shifted. The screaming stopped. The tower stilled. And in the sudden silence, I felt something change. Not just in the forest, but in the very nature of watching itself. Because maybe that was what it had needed all along. Not to be left alone, but to be seen completely. To be acknowledged. To be understood not as monster or myth, but as guardian. As the deep consciousness of wild places, the keeper of mysteries that humans were not meant to solve but simply to respect. I woke up at the base of Shadow Peak Tower, lying on a bed of pine needles soft as down. No injuries. No explanation for how I'd gotten there. Just the key still in my pocket and a profound sense of completion. The tower? Gone. Just an empty clearing where it used to stand, as if the structure had been carefully erased from reality without disturbing so much as a pine cone on the forest floor. No debris. No burn marks. No evidence it had ever existed. Like the forest had simply reclaimed what was always its own. I don't know exactly what happened that night in the space between midnight and dawn. I don't know if I stopped something, or completed something, or became part of something larger than human understanding. But I haven't dreamed of knocking since. And that voice, The hollow whisper that had haunted my nights for 2 years has gone silent. The Watcher is still there. I'm certain of that. In Thornwick Forest and places like it, in the deep woods where cell phones don't work and GPS satellites lose their signal. But it's different now. Patient rather than angry. Protective rather than predatory. Sometimes when I see a fire tower in the distance, a lonely sentinel against the sky, I check to see if it's still there the next day. Because one day, if the balance tips too far toward observation and away from mystery, it won't be. And no one will remember it ever was. Except for the few of us who understand that some things are meant to be watched from below, not above. That there are guardians in the deep places, and they have been patient with us far longer than we deserve. The Hollow Watcher still watches. But now, finally, it is seen. I took the job thinking it would be peaceful. Fresh air. Solitude. That whole get away from the world vibe that people in cubicles dream about during their lunch breaks. It was the spring of 2012. I just transferred from a ranger post in the scorching desert of Arizona to a more remote park in northern Washington state. The transition felt like stepping into another world entirely. Mountains that scraped the belly of storm clouds. Ancient forests so thick and primordial that sunlight died a slow death trying to penetrate the canopy. The kind of place where your cell signal doesn't just fade, it gives up and dies like it's been strangled, leaving you truly alone with nothing but the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of something unseen moving through the underbrush. My new station was called Whispering Pines, a nearly forgotten sector with only 2 full-time rangers assigned at any given time. The name should have been my first warning. Places don't get names like that by accident. They earn them. The other guy was Dave, a grizzled loner who'd worked there 17 years, long enough for the wilderness to hollow out his eyes and etch permanent lines of wariness around them. When I arrived, dusty and eager in my pressed uniform, he gave me a look like I wouldn't last a season. Like he'd seen my type before, young, ambitious, full of ideas about communing with nature, and watched them all fold under the weight of something they couldn't name. I didn't plan to prove him right. The ranger station was old but well kept, built from the same great timber that seemed to grow naturally from the forest floor. Inside, it felt like stepping back in time. There was a 2-way radio that crackled with static, even when no one was talking, a wall full of keys to cabins, gates, and maintenance sheds, each one labeled in fading ink on yellowed tags, and a logbook that had been updated religiously for decades. The entries went back to 1978, written in dozens of different hands, recording everything from bear sightings to equipment failures to unexplained incidents that were never quite explained. One of my duties, Dave explained over bitter coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration, was to check in on the Sorrows Rest Cabin, a supply cabin deeper in the woods and used by the public and marked on no official trail maps. Check it once a week, he said, tossing me a rusted key that felt ice cold against my palm. Make sure the place is sealed tight. Critters get in otherwise. He paused, staring out the window at the tree line. Other things, too, seemed simple enough. Standard maintenance. I asked if it was stocked with anything valuable that might attract thieves or vandals. He paused, just long enough to make me notice. Just long enough for the silence to stretch thin and uncomfortable between us. No, just old gear. First aid stuff. Ropes. Lanterns. Some rations. Another pause. Things left behind. I nodded, pocketed the key, and tried to forget about the hesitation in his voice. The way he said things left behind, like he meant more than equipment. I shouldn't have forgotten. In places like Whispering Pines, hesitation is a language all its own, and I was too new to speak it fluently. That first night, lying in the narrow bunk in my quarters, I listened to the forest settling around me. Every creak of timber, every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch felt amplified in the darkness. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. Like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I should have paid attention to that feeling. Should have trusted the primitive part of my brain that was already screaming warnings I was too civilized to hear. The first time I visited Sorrow's Rest Cabin, it felt like walking into a hell breath. Not terrifying, not even particularly creepy at first glance, but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. You know that sensation when you walk into a room and it's colder than it should be, like someone opened a door to winter that you can't see? Or when you find yourself whispering without knowing why, as if raising your voice might wake something that should stay sleeping. That feeling, but multiplied, concentrated, like the wrongness had been distilling there for years. It took an hour and a half to hike there through terrain that seemed designed to discourage visitors. The trail was narrow and choked with underbrush that clawed at my uniform, clearly not maintained for months, maybe years. I had to duck beneath branches that hung like gnarled fingers, kick aside debris that seemed to gather in deliberate patterns, and push through thickets that whispered against my legs like they were trying to hold me back. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birdsong, no scurrying of small animals, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of dead leaves under my boots. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin came into view like something from a fever dream. Weathered gray planks that looked almost black in the filtered light, shutters bolted shut tight as coffin lids, and a roof sagging slightly under decades of moss and accumulated weight of storms. The structure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a pocket of deeper shadow even in the middle of the day. The first weird thing, the padlock was open, just hanging there, swinging slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I froze at the edge of the clearing, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and report the cabin as compromised. No footprints in the patchy mud around the entrance. No tire tracks. No sign that anyone human had been there in months. But someone or something had opened that lock. I drew my radio, thumb hovering over the call button. Dave's voice echoed in my memory. Make sure the place is sealed tight. This wasn't sealed. This was an invitation. But to what? I approached slowly, hand resting on the bear spray clipped to my belt, though something told me bears weren't what I should be worried about. I pushed the door open with the toe of my boot, not wanting to touch it with my hands. Inside, the place was sparse in a way that felt deliberate. One cot with a thin mattress that looked like it had never been slept in, one old oil lantern sitting dead center on a rough wooden table, shelves full of dusty supplies arranged with military precision, and in the far corner, a trapdoor made of the same gray wood as the walls. The metal ring used to lift, it was polished bright, like it had been handled recently. I stepped inside, and immediately the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The floor creaked under my weight, but not randomly. It seemed to groan in rhythm, like the cabin was breathing around me. Cold air brushed against the back of my neck, even though the door was closed, carrying a smell I couldn't identify. Well, earthy, like something that had been buried a long time. Then I heard it. My name, whispered, faint, like it came from somewhere far below my feet, from under the floorboards, from beneath the earth itself. Mar. I stood dead still, heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them, brain trying to logic the sound away. Wind through cracks in the foundation. An animal in the walls. My imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. But I knew my own name, and I knew the difference between wind and whispers. The sound came again, longer this time, drawn out like a sigh. Mayar. I left quickly, slamming the door behind me and fumbling with a padlock until it clicked shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key to turn. I didn't run, not quite, but I walked fast enough that I was winded by the time I reached the main trail. Back at the station, I sat in front of the logbook for 20 minutes, pen in hand, trying to decide what to write. In the end, I logged it as cabin checked. Secure. I didn't mention the whisper. I didn't want to seem like a rookie spooked by shadows and old with settling in the wind, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop hearing my name in that voice that sounded like wind through dead leaves. and I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that cabin had been waiting for me specifically. That the open lock hadn't been an accident or a break-in. It had been an invitation with my name on it. 3 days later, I had to go back. A late spring storm had rolled through Whispering Pines like the fist of an angry god, knocking out power in several parts of the park and turning the forest into a maze of fallen trees and dangling power lines. The main office was running on backup generators, and Dave asked me to check if the emergency generator stored at Sorrow's Rest was still operational. Might need it if this keeps up, he said, not meeting my eyes. Storm season's getting worse every year. I took the trail again, this time with a heavy-duty flashlight, fresh batteries in my radio, and both bear spray and a flare gun on my belt. The forest looked different after the storm, more twisted, more hostile. Trees lay across the path like the bones of some massive creature, and I had to climb over or crawl under them to make progress. The canopy had been torn open in places, letting in shafts of gray light that only made the shadows deeper and more menacing. As I neared the cabin, something strange happened. I got this overwhelming sense of déjà vu, like I'd lived this exact moment before. Not just familiar, prophetic. Like I'd dreamed this scene already and was now walking through the memory of a dream. Trees fallen in the same exact positions. My boots stepping in the same puddle of storm water. Even the way the wind moved through the broken branches felt choreographed, rehearsed. This time the door was wide open. Not forced. Not damaged by the storm. Just swung open like a mouth waiting to swallow whatever stepped inside. Inside, impossibly, the lantern was lit. A warm, steady flame dancing behind the glass chimney, casting moving shadows on the walls that seemed to writhe independently of the light source. I hadn't lit it. I hadn't even touched it during my previous visit. And the wick had been bone dry the last time I saw it, the oil reservoir empty as a dead man's chest. I stepped inside cautiously, announcing myself like a cop entering a potentially hostile situation. Park ranger. Anyone here? This is official business. No response except the whisper of flame and the creaking of old wood. But I could hear something else. Something that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Slow. Rhythmic. Deliberate. Not mine. I was holding my breath without realizing it. The sound was coming from beneath the floor. From the trapdoor that was now standing wide open, revealing a square of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the lantern light. And from that darkness, I heard something I'll never forget as long as I live. It was my voice. My exact voice, with my exact inflection and accent, saying, "Don't go. Don't go. Don't go." Over and over, like a broken recording. Like a warning on infinite loop. But it wasn't just the words that terrified me. It was the tone. Desperate. Pleading. Like I was begging myself not to make a mistake that couldn't be undone. Like I was trying to save myself from something worse than death. The voice was coming from deep underground, echoing up through what sounded like a vast space beneath the cabin. How deep did that cellar go? And why did it sound like I was already down there, trapped and calling for help? I ran. I don't even remember locking the door or checking to make sure the place was secure. I just sprinted through the forest like something with teeth and claws was chasing me, lungs burning, branches whipping at my face, until I burst through the station door so hard it slammed against the wall. Dave looked up from his coffee, took one look at my face, and his expression went from mild annoyance to something approaching fear. "You opened the cellar?" he asked. Not what happened, or "Are you okay?" Just that one question, like it explained everything. "No," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "I didn't go down, but it was open. And I heard something." He nodded slowly, like this was exactly what he'd been afraid of. "We don't go in the cellar," he said quietly. "That's the rule." "What rule?" "What are you talking about?" He stared at me for a long moment, then walked to the locked filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out a folder marked Classified Ranger Personnel Only. Inside were incident reports, photographs, and what looked like official correspondence with park headquarters. "Sit down," he said. "There are things about this place you need to know." When someone says, "That's the rule," but can't explain why, it burrows into your brain like a parasite. It sets up camp in the part of your mind that's supposed to make sense of the world and starts eating away at everything you thought you understood. I pressed him. "Why? What's down there?" Dave poured himself a whiskey from a bottle he kept hidden behind a first aid kit. Middle of the day, hands shaking slightly as he filled the glass. That should have told me everything I needed to know about what he was about to share. Back in '95, he began, settling into his chair like he was preparing to carry a heavy weight. A ranger went missing. His name was Kyle Morrison. "Good kid. Been here about 6 months, just like you." Full of enthusiasm, thought he could handle anything the forest threw at him. He took a long pull of whiskey, grimaced, and continued. "There was a blizzard that February. Worst storm in 20 years. Knocked out power, blocked roads, cut us off from the outside world for almost a week. When it finally cleared, Kyle was sent to check on all the remote structures, make sure nothing had been damaged. Sorrow's Rest was on his list. What happened? He never came back. Dispatch lost radio contact around 2 p.m. Search and rescue found his truck parked at the trailhead the next morning, but no sign of Kyle. They followed his tracks to the cabin and found." Dave paused, staring into his glass like it might hold answers. "They found the place empty. Door hanging open. Supplies scattered around like there'd been a struggle. And the trapdoor was open. Did they search it?" Dave's laugh was bitter, hollow. "They tried. Lowered a rope down. Shine lights. Called Kyle's name. But no one would actually step inside that hole. The deputy said the air turned thick down there. Like soup. Like it pushed against your skin and made it hard to breathe. They could hear things moving around in the dark, but when they shined their lights, nothing was there." He finished his whiskey and immediately poured another. "They found scratch marks on the walls. Recent ones. Like someone had been clawing at the stone trying to get out. And at the bottom of the rope, they found Kyle's radio. Still working. Still crackling with static. But no Kyle. Jesus. What did they do? What any reasonable person would do. They called it a cave-in, said Kyle must have fallen through a weak spot in the floor and gotten trapped in a natural cave system. They sealed the trapdoor, nailed it shut with 2x4s, and posted the cabin as off-limits to the public. I waited, but something in his expression told me the story wasn't over. And 3 weeks later, the trapdoor was open again. Not forced. Not broken. Just open, like someone had removed all the boards from the inside. The nails were still there, driven deep into the wood. But the boards were gone. Vanished. Dave stared at me with eyes that had seen too much. "We don't go in the cellar," he said again. "That's the rule. It's been the rule for 17 years. I felt something cold crawling up my spine. What do you think happened to Kyle?" "I think Kyle is still down there," Dave said quietly. "I think he's been down there for 17 years, trying to warn people not to make the same mistake he did." The folder contained photographs from the initial search. Black and white images of the cabin interior, the open trapdoor, the scratch marks Dave had mentioned. But there was something else, something that made my hand shake as I held the pictures. In one photo, taken from above looking down into the cellar, there was a figure, barely visible in the shadows at the edge of the light. A human shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall, arms too long, standing perfectly still in the darkness. "That's not Kyle," I whispered. "No," Dave agreed. "That's something else. Something that was waiting for Kyle when he went down there. And now it's got company." I studied the other documents. Official reports that had been heavily redacted. Correspondence between the Park Service and what looked like federal agencies. References to unusual geological formations and electromagnetic anomalies and ongoing containment protocols. The Park Service knows about this. The Park Service is why this place exists, Dave said. Whispering Pines isn't a nature preserve. It's a quarantine zone. Has been since 1952, when they first discovered the entrance. Entrance to what? Something that's been under this mountain a lot longer than trees have been growing on top of it. Something that doesn't like visitors, but isn't above collecting them when they stumble into its territory. I felt the room spinning slightly. Then why do they have rangers here at all? Someone's got to keep watch. Make sure hikers don't wander too far off the marked trails. Make sure the containment protocols are followed. Make sure things that shouldn't exist stay buried where they belong. He pulled out one final document, a list of names and dates going back to 1952. Rangers, hikers, researchers, all missing. All last seen in the vicinity of what was now called Sorrow's Rest Cabin. Kyle Morrison was number 47, Dave said. And according to the reports, the activity has been increasing over the past few years. More incidents, stronger manifestations. Like whatever's down there is getting hungry. I stared at the list, counting names. 47 people who had walked into that forest and never walked out. Why didn't you tell me this before I went there? Dave's expression was almost apologetic. Because you wouldn't have believed me. And because sometimes knowing too much makes things worse. Fear feeds it. The more afraid you are, the stronger it gets. Then why are you telling me now? Because it's already noticed you. It knows your name. It's calling for you. He finished his second whiskey and looked me straight in the eye. And because I think you're going to go back anyway, no matter what I say. They always do. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the ranger station. In the distance, I could swear I heard something calling my name through the trees. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old ranger station felt like footsteps on the roof. Every gust of wind sounded like whispers, like my name being stretched thin and sick through the pine branches outside my window. I kept the radio on, even though the only voices coming through were distant Park Service communications from stations hundreds of miles away. The static between transmissions became a kind of white noise, drowning out the sounds that might have been real and the ones I was probably imagining. But something changed the next morning. Something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. I found the key to Sorrow's Rest Cabin sitting on my chest when I woke up. Not on the nightstand. Not on the floor where it might have fallen from my pocket. Dead center on my chest, lying over my heart like some kind of ceremonial offering. The metal was ice cold against my skin, and when I picked it up, it was slightly damp, not with dew, but with something thicker. Something that smelled like earth and old copper. I hadn't put it there. I'd left it hanging on the keyboard in the main office before turning in. I was absolutely certain of that because I'd made a point of hanging it in the exact center of the board, between the keys for the maintenance shed and the equipment locker. A small act of defiance against the fear that was growing inside me like a tumor. But there it was, resting against my sternum like it belonged there. Like it had been waiting for me to wake up and accept what I already knew was inevitable. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands. The key was older than it had looked before, not just rusted, but ancient. The metal was worn smooth in places, like it had been handled by countless fingers over decades. Centuries, maybe. And etched into the bow were symbols I didn't recognize. Not letters or numbers, but something else. Something that hurt to look at directly, like staring into a bright light. Dave was gone when I got to the main office. His truck was still in the parking area, but the building was empty. No note. No message on the radio log. Just gone, like he'd evaporated into the morning mist. I called his name, checked his quarters, even looked in the supply shed behind the building. Nothing. But on his desk, I found the logbook open to a fresh page with a single entry in handwriting I didn't recognize. The door is open. The way is clear. Come home. The timestamp was 3:17 a.m. The exact moment I'd woken up to find the key on my chest. I radioed park headquarters, reported Dave as missing, and requested backup. The response crackled through static that seemed to form words if you listened hard enough. Stand by, Whispering Pines. We'll send a team when the weather clears. But I could see blue sky through the office windows. The weather was perfect. That's when I knew I was on my own. Whatever was happening at Sorrow's Rest Cabin, whatever had taken Kyle Morrison and now Dave, it wasn't going to wait for backup to arrive. It was calling in its debts, and my name was next on the list. I could have left, should have left, packed my gear, hiked out to the main road, and never looked back. But the key in my pocket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and every time I considered running, I heard Dave's voice. They always go back anyway, so I went back. The forest was different this time. Not just quiet, empty. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as I made my way along the increasingly familiar trail. The trees appeared to lean inward as I passed, creating a tunnel of shadow that grew darker with each step. But the strangest thing was how easy the hike felt. The trail that had been choked with debris and fallen branches was now clear, almost manicured. The distance that had taken me an hour and a half before passed in what felt like minutes. Like the forest itself was pulling me forward, eager to deliver me to my destination. When I reached the clearing, I stopped dead. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it 3 days earlier. Door closed, padlock in place, shutters sealed tight, but surrounding it, pressed into the soft earth like a cropped circle of despair, were dozens of footprints, all the same size, all made by the same boots. My boots. The prints formed concentric circles around the cabin, spiraling inward toward the door. Some were fresh, the tread still sharp in the damp soil. Others were older, partially filled with leaves and rain. But all of them were mine, as if I'd been walking these circles for weeks without remembering. I approached the door with a key already in my hand, though I didn't remember taking it out of my pocket. It slid into the lock like it had been oiled, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo through the forest. Inside, the cabin had changed. The sparse furnishings were still there, the cot, the shelves, the oil lamp. But now the walls were covered with writing, carved deep into the wood with something sharp. Names and dates going back decades. Messages of warning and desperation scratched in frantic handwriting. Don't go down. It's not what you think. The echoes never stop. I've been here before. And scattered among the older carvings, in fresher cuts that still wept sap, were messages in my own handwriting. This is the 4th time. Mark, remember the whispers. Don't trust your own voice. I didn't remember carving any of them. But the knife work was precise, deliberate. Someone had spent hours working on these walls. Someone who knew exactly what I was going to find down in that cellar. The trapdoor was open, of course. Had probably been open since the moment I'd found the key on my chest. The darkness below seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, breathing in and out like the throat of some massive creature. As I approached the opening, I could hear them. Voices. Dozens of voices, all talking at once in the space beneath the cabin. I recognized some of them. Dave's gruff baritone, a younger voice that might have been Kyle Morrison. And threading through all of them, like a twisted harmony, was my own voice. Not just one version of my voice. Multiple versions. Having different conversations, calling out different warnings, pleading with someone to listen and understand. Mark, don't come down here. Mark, you've done this before. Mark, there's no way out once you enter. Mark, it feeds on memory. That's why you keep forgetting. I knelt at the edge of the trapdoor, peering into the darkness. The voices grew louder, more insistent. Below, I could see the faint outline of wooden steps leading down into what looked like a natural cave system. The walls glowed with a phosphorescent light that hurt to look at directly. And at the bottom of the steps, barely visible in the sickly green glow, were figures, dozens of them, standing perfectly still, faces turned up toward me. I recognized Dave immediately. He was standing at the foot of the steps, mouth open like he was calling my name, but the sound coming out was all wrong. Too deep, too hollow. Next to him was a younger man in a ranger uniform that looked like it was from the 1990s. Kyle Morrison, probably. His eyes were completely black, and his mouth moved in perfect synchronization with one of the voices calling my name. But it was the other figures that made me understand the true horror of the situation. They weren't all rangers. Some wore hiking gear from different decades. Others were in clothes that looked like they were from the 1950s, maybe earlier. And scattered among them, standing in different positions but with identical postures, were multiple versions of myself. 5. No, 6 different versions of Mark, all wearing the same uniform I was wearing now, all staring up at me with expressions of desperate warning. One held up his hand, showing me the same key I was clutching. Another pointed behind me, mouthing the word "run" over and over. But the worst part was the figure standing in the very center of the group. Tall. Impossibly tall. Its limbs too long for its torso. Its face a void that seemed to absorb the phosphorescent light. This was what had been collecting visitors to Sorrow's Rest Cabin. This was the thing that lived in the mountain's depths and fed on what? Fear? Memory. The very essence of what made people human. As I watched, the thing raised one elongated hand and beckoned to me. The gesture was almost polite, almost welcoming. And despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself putting one foot on the first step. The moment my boot touched the wood, the voices stopped. All of them. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the cacophony had been. Even the normal sounds of the forest, sounds I hadn't realized I was hearing, disappeared completely. In that perfect quiet, I heard something that made my legs nearly give out. My own voice, coming from directly behind me, whispered, "This is how it always starts." I spun around, but the cabin was empty. Just the carved walls and the flickering oil lamp. But I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows, could sense movement at the very edges of my vision. I took another step down, then another. Each step felt predetermined, like I was following a script I'd performed many times before. The phosphorescent walls pulsed brighter as I descended, and I could see that they weren't natural rock formations at all. They were covered in symbols, the same symbols I'd noticed on the key, but thousands of them, carved into every surface in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. Halfway down the steps, I heard Dave's voice clearly for the first time. "Mark, you need to remember. This is the 7th time you've come down here. Each time you forget a little more. Each time it gets harder to find your way back. 7 times? That couldn't be right. I'd only been at Whispering Pines for a few days. But even as I thought it, memories began surfacing. Fragments. Images of walking this trail before, of finding that key, of descending these same steps while different versions of Dave called out warnings I couldn't quite remember. At the bottom of the steps, the cavern opened up into a vast underground space that defied the physics of what could exist beneath a small mountain cabin. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the floor stretched out in all directions, covered with the same glowing symbols. The air was thick and warm, like breathing soup, and it tasted of copper and old earth. The collected figures stood in perfect formation around the edges of the space, all facing inward toward the center where the tall thing waited. As I approached, they began to speak in unison. "Welcome back, Mark. We've been waiting for you to remember." When I opened my eyes, I was back in the ranger station, sitting at the desk, pen in hand, staring at the logbook. The entry I'd apparently just written read, "Cabin checked. Secure. No incidents to report." My handwriting. My signature. But I didn't remember writing it. I looked at the clock. 4:30 p.m. The last thing I remembered clearly was finding the key on my chest that morning and deciding to hike back to Sorrow's Rest Cabin. Everything after that was fragments, flashes of carved walls and glowing symbols and voices calling my name from underground. but my uniform was covered in dirt and pine needles. My boots were caked with mud from the forest trail, and my hands were stained with something that looked like phosphorescent residue, glowing faintly green in the afternoon light filtering through the station windows. Dave's desk was exactly as I'd found it that morning. Still no sign of him. His coffee cup still half full and stone cold. The classified folder still lying open, though now the photographs looked different somehow. Blurrier. Like the images were fading. I tried to radio park headquarters again, but got only static. When I checked the radio's frequency settings, they were all wrong, tuned to channels that didn't exist according to the manual. I adjusted them back to the correct frequencies and tried again. Whispering Pines to headquarters. Come in. The response came immediately, clear as daylight. Go ahead, Whispering Pines. Requesting immediate backup. My partner Dave Harrison is missing. Last seen yesterday evening. I need a search and rescue team. A pause. Then, Whispering Pines, we show no ranger named Dave Harrison assigned to your station. You're listed as working solo. Have been for the past 6 months. 6 months? I only been there a few days. But even as I started to protest, doubt crept in. Had it been longer? The memories felt slippery, hard to grasp, like trying to hold water in my cupped hands. Sir, I need to speak with someone about the Sorrows Rest Cabin. There are irregularities that need to be investigated. Another pause, longer this time. Whispering Pines, there is no structure designated as Sorrows Rest Cabin on your sector grid. Please clarify your location. I pulled out the hand-drawn map Dave had given me, or thought he'd given me. The paper was blank. Just yellowed parchment with faded fold lines, as if words had been there once but had slowly dissolved away. There was a cabin, about 2 hours hike northeast of my position. Supply cache. I was supposed to check on it weekly. Negative, Whispering Pines. No supply caches or structures in that area. Are you feeling all right? You sound disoriented. I looked down at my hands. The phosphorescent stains were fading as I watched, disappearing like they'd never been there at all. Yes, I'm fine. False alarm. Probably just fatigue. Copy that. Get some rest. We'll check in tomorrow. I sat in the silence of the empty station, trying to piece together what was real and what wasn't. The classified folder was still on the desk, but when I opened it, most of the pages were blank. Just a few incident reports from years past. Nothing about missing rangers or underground anomalies. But the list of names was still there. 47 people who had disappeared in the area over the decades. And at the bottom, in fresh ink that hadn't been there before, was a new entry. Dave Harrison Park Ranger, disappeared 2012, last seen vicinity of abandoned cabin ruins. I grabbed the key from my pocket, except it wasn't there. I searched my entire uniform, then the office, then my quarters. No key. No rusted metal with strange symbols. Nothing but the growing certainty that I was losing my mind. That night, I went through Dave's personal effects, looking for some proof that he'd existed. His quarters were exactly as I remembered them, spare and utilitarian. But there were no personal items. No photographs, no letters from family, no books with his name written inside the covers. Just standard-issue Ranger equipment and furniture that looked like it had never been used. I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my own reflection. I looked older than I remembered. More weathered. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when I'd started this job. When had I started this job? The memory felt fuzzy, uncertain. In the mirror, I could see the wall behind me. And carved into the wood, so faint I almost missed it, were words that made my blood freeze. Mark, this is the 8th time. Look under the floorboards. I spun around, but the wall was blank. Smooth wood, no markings. When I turned back to the mirror, the words were gone. But I found myself kneeling on the floor anyway, running my hands along the floorboards near the window. One of them was loose. It lifted easily, revealing a small hollow space beneath. Inside was a metal box, and sitting on top of it, impossible but undeniable, was the key to Sorrow's rest cabin. The symbols etched into the metal seemed to pulse in the lamplight, and when I touched it, I could hear whispers starting up again outside the station, faint but growing stronger. My name, carried on the wind through the pines. I opened the box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of me standing in front of the cabin. But in each photo, I looked slightly different. Different uniform, different equipment, different season. In some, I was smiling. In others, I looked terrified. In the most recent ones, I looked hollow-eyed and desperate. At the bottom of the box was a journal. My handwriting, but entries I didn't remember writing. First time. Found the cabin today. Something's wrong with this place. Third time. I think I'm starting to remember. The thing underground, it doesn't kill you. It collects you. Uses you. Fifth time. Dave isn't real. He's just another echo, another memory it's using to lure people down. I was the one who found Kyle Morrison's body. I was the one who reported him missing. But it makes me forget. Seventh time. I understand now. This mountain is hollow. What lives underneath is old. Older than the trees, older than the rocks. It feeds on consciousness, on the essence of what makes us who we are. Each time I go down, it takes a little more. Each time I come back, I remember a little less. The final entry was dated yesterday. Eighth time. I can feel it calling me back. The key appeared again this morning. I know what's going to happen. I know I'll walk the trail, I'll open the door, I'll descend the steps. And when I come back, I'll remember even less than I do now. Maybe this time I won't come back at all. Maybe this time I'll join the others permanently. If anyone finds this journal, don't look for the cabin. Don't follow the trails that aren't on any maps. And if you hear your name whispered in the wind, run. Run and never look back. The thing under the mountain is patient. It's been collecting people for centuries. But it's getting stronger, hungrier. And I think it's almost ready to stop hiding. I dropped the journal, hands shaking. Outside, the whispers were getting louder, more insistent. And beneath them, I could hear something else. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps circling the ranger station. I went to the window and peered through the blinds. They were all there. Dave, Kyle Morrison, and dozens of others I recognized from the photographs in the classified folder. All wearing uniforms from different eras, all walking in perfect synchronization around the building. Their faces were pale, eyes black as the spaces between stars. And bringing up the rear of this impossible procession were 7 versions of myself, each one from a different visit to the cabin, each one slightly more hollow than the last. As I watched, the most recent version, the one that looked almost exactly like me, but with those empty, hungry eyes, looked up at the window and smiled. Then he raised his hand and pointed toward the forest, toward the trail that led to Sorrow's rest cabin. The whispers suddenly stopped. The footsteps ceased. The forest went completely silent. And then, from directly behind me in the empty station, I heard my own voice. It's time to go home, Mark. We're all waiting for you. I never used to believe in haunted places. Haunted people, maybe. Bad energy, sure. But buildings, structures made of wood and stone, those were just containers, empty vessels that held only what we brought to them. Fear was a human invention, I told myself. Buildings didn't remember. They couldn't hold grudges or harbor malice. That changed the year I was stationed at Shadow Peak Observatory, an abandoned ranger station built in the early 1900s and decommissioned in the 80s. The structure had been sealed off for decades after a string of ranger deaths were deemed accidental, though no one ever explained how a man could fall down a locked stairwell that led nowhere, or why a second ranger hanged himself in the pantry with rope that shouldn't have been there. The official reports were thin, sanitized. But the locals who lived in the valley below, they had stories. Stories about lights in the windows when no one was inside, about voices carried on the wind, about hikers who ventured too close and came back different, if they came back at all. I didn't want to go. No one did. The assignment was passed around like a death sentence, each ranger finding excuses, calling in favors, anything to avoid those keys. But that winter, a landslide wiped out the main watch point in our northern range, and we needed elevation to monitor for avalanches. The weather patterns were shifting, becoming more violent, more unpredictable. Lives depended on having eyes on that mountain. The only structure still standing with adequate sight lines? Shadow Peak Observatory. My supervisor gave me the keys like he was handing over a loaded gun. His hand shook slightly as he pressed the cold metal into my palm, and his eyes held something I'd never seen before, genuine fear. He mumbled something about radio protocols and emergency procedures, but I could see he didn't expect me to need them. Not in the way they were intended. The hike up took 6 hours through terrain that seemed designed to discourage visitors. The trail switched back through dense pine forests that grew darker and more oppressive with each step. Ancient trees pressed close to the path, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. The air grew thinner and colder as I climbed, carrying with it an odd metallic taste that coated my tongue and made my teeth ache. The station sat on a ridge overlooking Desolation Gorge, stunning in the daylight, terrifying by dusk. From my vantage point, I could see the chasm yawning below like an open wound in the earth, its depths lost in shadow even when the sun was at its peak. The building itself was a 2-story log cabin with wraparound decking and shuttered windows, bleached gray from decades of storms. Weather had scoured the wood smooth, giving it an almost skeletal appearance. The radio antenna still stood, though it leaned at an unnatural angle, as if something had tried to tear it down but given up halfway through. The interior had been cleaned out by the last maintenance crew, mostly, but they'd left things behind. Whether by oversight or design, I couldn't tell. I found 3 things that would haunt my dreams. A broken pocket watch in the main room, its crystal cracked but still ticking with a rhythm that seemed just slightly off from my heartbeat. A topographical map of the surrounding trails pinned to the wall, with certain areas circled in red ink that had faded to the color of dried blood. The circles formed no pattern I could discern, but they seemed to pulse when I looked at them directly. And a note scrawled in pencil on the wall by the door, the letters carved deep enough to feel under my fingertips. If you hear the whistling, don't answer. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Someone had pressed hard enough to gouge the wood, as if their life depended on making sure the message would survive. I told myself it was a prank. Rangers were notorious for their dark humor, for trying to spook the new guy. The previous occupant probably got bored during the long nights and decided to leave a little something to unnerve his replacement. That rationalization lasted 2 days. 2 days of blessed, ignorant silence. It was just after 1 a.m. when my world changed forever. I was reading in my bunk, a worn paperback thriller that suddenly seemed laughably tame compared to my surroundings. The station was quiet except for the usual sounds: wind through the eaves, the occasional crack of settling wood, the distant hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness below. Then the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like something heavy had stepped into the room and displaced the atmosphere. The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath misting in the lamplight. No breeze, no open windows. The shutters were latched tight against the mountain cold. Just a pocket of Arctic air that seemed to materialize from nothing, centering around my bed like an invisible presence had claimed the space beside me. The hair on my arms stood up. My skin prickled with electricity. Then came the sound that would follow me for the rest of my life. A low, drawn-out whistle coming from inside the wall behind my bed. Not a tune, not a melody that I could recognize or hum along with. Just 5 notes, hollow, breathless, each one hanging in the air like a question mark before dissolving into silence. It didn't sound played by lips or tongue. It sounded exhaled, like something buried in the wall was slowly pushing the last of its air through pursed, bloodless lips, like a dying breath stretched into an eternity of want. I froze in my bed, the book falling from numb fingers. The sound penetrated not just my ears, but my bones, vibrating through the mattress and into my spine. It was the loneliest sound I'd ever heard, a call from somewhere so isolated, so forgotten, that it might have been echoing from the bottom of the world. Then I remembered the note, "If you hear the whistling, don't answer." I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. I lay there like a corpse, every muscle locked in terror, waiting for what would come next. The whistling stopped and didn't return that night, but I never really slept again. The next morning, I tore the paneling off the wall with the desperation of a man trying to prove his own sanity. The wood came away in long strips, revealing the skeleton of the building underneath. There was nothing behind it but stone foundation and yellowed insulation that crumbled at my touch. No vents, no holes, no hollow spaces where sound could travel or hide. Just cold silence and the musty smell of decades-old construction. I pressed my ear to the stone, listening for pipes or wiring that might explain the sound. Nothing. The wall was solid, ancient, thick enough to muffle a scream. Whatever I'd heard hadn't come through any conventional means. That day, the snow started falling harder. Fat, heavy flakes that stuck to everything and muffled the world in white silence. I knew I'd be stuck up there for at least another week, maybe more if the weather worsened. The supply chopper wouldn't risk a flight in that kind of visibility, and the trail would be impassable until the storm cleared. I was alone with whatever lived in the walls. The second night, I heard the whistle again. This time, it came from under the floorboards. Same 5 notes, but deeper now, more resonant. The sound seemed to rise from the very foundation of the building, from somewhere far below where the mountain's roots began. It vibrated through the floor and into my feet, traveling up my legs and settling in my chest like a physical presence. But this time, the notes didn't just fade away. They ended with a whisper. "Are you there?" The voice was soft, conversational, almost gentle, like a friend calling through a door. But underneath the pleasantness was something else, a hunger that made my blood run cold. I didn't respond. Every instinct screamed at me to stay silent, to pretend I hadn't heard. But something laughed anyway. Dry, raspy, like a smoker who hadn't used their voice in years or decades. The sound crawled out from under the floorboards and filled the room, echoing off the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It knew I was listening. It knew I was afraid. And it was pleased. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the corner with my back to the wall, rifle across my knees, watching the shadows dance in the lamplight until dawn broke gray and reluctant over the mountains. On the 4th night, the whistling came from above. I lay in my bunk, staring up at the exposed rafters, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the ceiling, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation for the sound that now seemed to be stalking me through the building. The whistle echoed through the wooden beams like a ghost trapped in the architecture, bouncing and multiplying until I couldn't tell where it originated. 5 notes, always the same 5 notes, but now they seemed to carry a mocking quality, as if my tormentor was enjoying this game of cat and mouse. Then came something new. Tapping. Not the random percussion of wind or settling wood. This was deliberate, rhythmic, purposeful. A pattern that made my blood freeze. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 more. Then silence that stretched until I thought it was over. Then again. 3. Pause. 2. I recognized it immediately. Years of emergency training had drilled the basics of Morse code into every ranger's head, and this pattern was burned into my memory. I grabbed a pencil and paper with shaking hands, transcribing the sounds as they continued, over and over, like a broken record stuck on the same terrible song. The message, when I finally deciphered it, made me vomit into the trash can beside my bed. ISEYOU. That's when the smell hit me. Rotting earth. Rich, black wrong. Like a grave that had been opened too early, before its occupant was ready to meet the air again. The stench rolled through the room in waves, so thick I could taste it, coating my tongue with the flavor of decay and forgotten things. I sat by the door for the rest of the night, rifle in hand, watching the darkness and waiting for sunrise. Praying for sunrise. It didn't come. That morning, the light never changed. I'd been watching the windows for hours, waiting for that first hint of dawn, that gradual shift from black to gray that meant I'd survive another night. But the darkness outside remained absolute, impenetrable, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the world. No sunrise, no sunset, just permanent gray twilight that pressed against the windows like something alive. I checked my watch, certain that I'd lost track of time in my terror. 1:17 a.m. The same time as the first whistle. I checked the wall clock in the main room, thinking my watch had stopped. Same time. I checked my phone, my radio, even the atomic clock display on my weather station. All of them frozen at 1:17 a.m., as if time itself had gotten stuck in that moment when my nightmare began. Then I remembered the broken pocket watch I'd found on day one. I'd left it on the table, dismissing it as another piece of forgotten junk. But now I picked it up with trembling fingers, studying its cracked face and corroded hands. It was ticking. Despite the spider web of fractures across its crystal, despite the green patina that covered its case, the second hand moved with mechanical precision. And it read exactly what all the others did. 1:17 a.m. The moment when the whistling started. The moment when whatever haunted this place first acknowledged my presence. I was trapped in that instant, suspended in time like an insect in amber. I radioed base, my voice cracking with desperation. Nothing but static answered back, not even the usual background chatter of other stations. The airwaves were dead, as if the entire world had gone silent. Tried my satellite phone. The display showed no signal, no connection to the network of towers and satellites that should have been my lifeline to civilization. I was cut off, isolated, alone with whatever wanted to play its twisted games. I walked outside to check the weather, hoping to find some rational explanation for my communication failures. But I wasn't on the ridge anymore. The familiar landscape I'd hiked through just days before was gone. Instead of the open overlook above Desolation Gorge, the station was surrounded by trees. Dense, towering pines that pressed close to the building like curious onlookers, their branches scraping against the roof and walls with sounds that might have been whispers. Dark, wrong, alien. The forest stretched in every direction, unbroken and impenetrable. No gorge, no distant peaks, no trail leading back to the world I knew. Like the whole mountain had shifted while I slept, rearranging itself according to rules I couldn't comprehend. And then, close enough to feel the breath behind it, came the whistle again. Right behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. No one. Just the door, swinging open on hinges that shouldn't have moved, inviting me back inside. Inside the station, it was dark as pitch. The lamps I'd left burning were extinguished. The battery-powered emergency lights were dead. Even my flashlight seemed dimmed, its beams swallowed by shadows that felt almost solid, almost alive. The power was gone, but that was impossible. The station ran on solar batteries and a backup generator, systems designed to keep running even in the worst conditions. Yet somehow everything had failed at once, leaving me in a darkness so complete it had weight. I lit my hurricane lantern with fingers that shook so badly I nearly dropped the matches. The flame caught and flared, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of the light source. And in the hallway, something stood waiting. Not a man, not an animal, not anything that belonged in the world of the living. Just tall, impossibly tall, with a frame that stretched toward the ceiling like taffy pulled too thin. Its arms hung down past its knees, almost brushing the floor, and ended in fingers that were too long, too jointed, like someone had added extra bones just to make them more wrong. No feet, just shadows pooling where legs should be, as if it was melting into the floor and reforming at the same time. A face that wasn't a face, just stretched skin pulled tight over something that might once have been human. No mouth that I could see. No eyes, just dark hollows that seemed to go on forever. But it whistled. Those same 5 notes, coming from somewhere inside that featureless head. The sound bypassed its non-existent lips and seemed to emerge from the very air around it, filling the hallway with that familiar, terrible melody. Then it spoke, and its voice was everything I'd feared it would be. You answered. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat had locked up completely, every muscle in my body frozen by terror so profound it felt like paralysis. I stood there, lantern shaking in my grip, watching this impossibility regard me with empty sockets that somehow still managed to convey amusement. The thing turned, not walked, just pivoted like a mannequin being rotated by invisible hands, and melted into the wall. Gone. But not really gone. Never really gone. I could feel it moving through the building now, flowing through the spaces between the studs and joists like water finding its way downhill, settling into every corner, every shadow, until the entire structure pulsed with its presence. I barricaded myself in the radio room, the only space in the building that felt even remotely safe. Using furniture, equipment, anything I could move, I built a fortress around myself. Stacked chairs against the door. Pushed the desk across the window. Created a circle of lanterns that I kept burning at all times, reasoning that whatever stalked me seemed to prefer the dark. For 3 days, or what I thought were 3 days, though time had become meaningless, the station shifted around me. Doors that had opened into bedrooms now led to closets that hadn't existed before. Windows showed landscapes I didn't recognize, snow-covered peaks on the left side of the building, burning forests on the right. Sometimes, if I looked long enough, I could see figures moving in those impossible vistas, shapes that might have been human if humans could be that tall, that wrong. Time remained frozen at 1:17 a.m., that cursed moment stretching into infinity. But the Whistler came every night. Closer, bolder, more persistent. He began knocking on my barricaded door, and each knock sent vibrations through my bones that made my teeth ache. The sound wasn't just heard. It was felt, experienced, absorbed until I couldn't tell where it ended and I began. Always in patterns. Always Morse code messages that grew more personal, more intimate with each transmission. Sometimes gibberish, strings of letters that might have been names or places from somewhere else entirely. Sometimes threats disguised as invitations. Come play. Let me in. Don't you remember? But the worst message came on what I thought was the final night. You used to live here. That's when I lost it completely. I screamed into the radio until my voice cracked and bled, begging anyone, anywhere to hear me. I called out coordinates, descriptions, anything that might bring help. The static that answered back seemed to mock my desperation, crackling with a rhythm that almost sounded like laughter. But then, just when I thought I'd finally snapped completely, came something that changed everything. A reply. A man's voice, distant and broken, struggling through interference that sounded like whispers. He'll crawl inside you if you listen too long. Then nothing but silence. But in that silence, I heard footsteps approaching my door. Slow, deliberate, patient. The Whistler had tired of games. On the 8th day, or perhaps the 8th hour, or the 8th year, the front door unlatched. I heard the sound from my barricaded room, the slow creak of hinges that had been sealed shut, the whisper of air moving through a suddenly open space. It was a sound I'd been dreading and praying for in equal measure. The snow was gone when I peered through my window. The impossible forest had retreated, leaving behind the familiar ridge and the distant view of Desolation Gorge. Sunlight, real sunlight, not the sick gray twilight that had imprisoned me, poured through the opening like a benediction. I didn't wait to question this miraculous change. I didn't pack my gear or secure the station or follow any of the protocols I'd been trained to observe. I ran down the mountain through terrain that shifted and blurred around me, as if reality was still deciding what it wanted to be. Through trees that sometimes looked familiar and sometimes belonged to alien forests. The trail appeared and disappeared under my feet, but I kept moving, driven by an instinct older than thought. I didn't stop running until I reached Riverside Station, a ranger post 14 miles south that had never looked so beautiful, so solid, so real. The rangers there stared at me like I was a ghost when I stumbled through their door, babbling about time loops and creatures in the walls. They gave me water and a place to sit and called for a medical evacuation, certain I was suffering from hypothermia or altitude sickness or a complete mental breakdown. They said I'd been missing for 2 hours. Not days, not weeks, not the eternity I'd experienced in that place where time forgot how to move forward. 2 hours. But the watch in my pocket, that broken, impossible pocket watch, still ticked with its off-rhythm heartbeat. Still read 1:17 a.m. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I could still hear those 5 notes echoing in my memory. They sealed off Shadow Peak Observatory for good after my report. Not because they believed my story, the official investigation cited structural instability, environmental hazards as the reasons for permanent closure. But I saw the way the investigators looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching. The way they hurried through their documentation and recommended the immediate installation of warning signs and barriers. No one's allowed near it now. The trail has been officially closed, the access road gated and locked. But barriers have never stopped determined hikers, especially those drawn by the mystery of forbidden places. Sometimes people still go missing up that way. Usually, they're found within a few hours, stumbling down the mountain with stories about getting turned around and whether that shouldn't have existed. Confused tales about time moving strangely, about sounds in the forest that didn't belong. And when they're found, they always say the same thing. I heard whistling in the walls, but I never answer when they ask me what it means. I don't ever answer those questions, because I know what happens if you do. I know what lives in the spaces between seconds, in the gaps where time forgets to flow forward. I know about the hunger that waits in walls and shadows, patient as death, feeding on fear and isolation until it grows strong enough to reach through the barriers between worlds. Sometimes in the deep hours of the night, I still hear my phone ring with no caller ID. I still find notes in my own handwriting that I don't remember writing. Warnings about places I've never been and names I've never heard. The pocket watch sits in my desk drawer, wrapped in cloth I change regularly because it grows cold to the touch. It still ticks. It still reads 1:17 a.m. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the world grows quiet enough, I can hear other sounds echoing from inside its cracked crystal face. 5 notes. Hollow. Breathless. Waiting for someone to answer. But I never do. I never will. Because some doors, once open, can never be completely closed. And some things, once awakened, never really go back to sleep. There's a trail out in the Whispering Bone Mountains they don't mark on the map. You won't find it in any brochure. Rangers don't talk about it. Locals pretend they've never heard of it. But the trail is there. It starts at the back of a clearing that always feels colder than the rest of the park, a place the old-timers call the Morning Hollow, covered in pine needles that never seem to decay, never seem to shift. No signs, no markings, just an oppressive silence that seems to swallow sound itself. I only know about it because I followed a man into it, a man who left no footprints. I was 6 years into the job. Stationed near the Devil's Throat Ranger Station, mostly desk duty and lost hikers. Not glamorous, but I liked it. I liked the quiet, the control. There's comfort in knowing every trail, every hill, every possible place someone could disappear in these cursed peaks that locals whisper about only when the wind is still. The mountains had always been strange. Native tribes call this region where shadows walk backward, and avoided it entirely. Even now, Compasses spin wildly near certain ridges, and cell towers fail without explanation. But in 6 years, I never encountered anything I couldn't rationalize. Then came the 911 call. An old hiker, James Halloran, reported seeing a man in a park ranger uniform walking alone. No pack, no gear, no name badge. His voice shook as he described the encounter, words tumbling over each other like he was afraid silence would let something terrible catch up. He said the man wasn't walking like a person out for a stroll. He was moving with purpose, straight into the woods. Not on a path, not even where paths used to be. He just walked. It was like the trees were parting for him, Halloran whispered. Like they were afraid. I arrived at Morning Hollow the next day, armed with GPS, compass, radio, and 20 years of hiking experience. The clearing sat at the junction of 3 valleys, where the ancient pines grew so thick their canopy blocked the sun even at midday. Found Halloran's boot prints, size 11 merrills, and the spot where he stopped. The impression showed he'd backpedaled quickly, his heels digging deep gouges in the soft earth. And then nothing. No other footprints. No tire marks. No animal tracks. The strange thing was, even the usual forest sounds were absent. No squirrels chittering. No birds calling. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place, leaving the air unnaturally still. Except there were broken twigs, pressed leaves, disturbed moss on fallen logs. A trail of disturbances that formed a clear path deeper into the Bone Ridge wilderness. Sign someone had walked through. Someone who left no trail. That's when I saw him. At the tree line, where the ancient pines gave way to the jagged rocks of Widow's Peak. Far off, just barely in view. Back turned to me. Ranger hat. Dark green uniform. Tall, maybe 6'5", with shoulders that seemed too broad for any human frame. I called out, "Hey, you need help." My voice echoed strangely, as if the mountains were mocking me. He didn't turn, didn't even flinch, just took one step into the trees and vanished. Not walked away, vanished, like he'd stepped through an invisible door. I chased him. The strange part, there was a trail, faint, winding, only visible if you were looking for it, like those optical illusions that shift when you stare too long. But I swear to you, it hadn't been there before he stepped forward, as if his steps created it. The path wound through terrain I'd never seen before, though I'd hiked these mountains for years. Twisted trees with bark that looked burned, though no fire had touched these peaks in decades. Stones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And everywhere, that oppressive silence that made my own breathing sound like thunder. I followed. No footprints. No sound. The trees grew closer, tighter, their branches weaving together overhead like gnarled fingers. Sky faded from blue to gray to something that wasn't quite black. Even birdsong stopped, as if every living thing had fled. My radio crackled with static, then died. Then I noticed the signs. Carvings on trees. Names. Dates. Hundreds of them, carved into the bark of pines that must have been centuries old. Some from the 1800s. Some from decades ago. Some from the future. All etched in with the same style, same depth, same hand. As if carved by someone who had all the time in the world and hands that never tired. All scratched below a simple message. He walked this way. The oldest carving I could find was dated 1823, with a name I couldn't quite make out. The letters seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Below it, in fresher cuts, turn Teofalo. Lost myself. Can't find way back. After what felt like hours, I lost all sense of time and direction. My GPS had stopped working miles back, the screen showing nothing but static snow. Compass spun in wild circles, the needle dancing like it was possessed. I turned to go back, trail gone, swallowed by earth and shadow. The trees had closed ranks behind me, their trunks so close together I couldn't have squeezed between them with a crowbar. Then just ahead, where the path curved around a massive boulder that looked like a crouching giant, I saw the man again. Same posture. Same uniform. This time he was facing me. I stopped cold, my breath catching in my throat. His face was wrong. Too smooth, like melted wax that had been shaped by blind hands. Like someone had pressed a mannequin's head onto a real body. No features. Just skin. Stretched tight where eyes should be. No mouth. No nose. But somehow, I knew he was looking at me. Studying me. Measuring me. He raised one hand. Fingers too long, joints bending in ways that made my stomach turn. Not to wave. To point. Behind me. I turned, heart hammering against my ribs. No one. Just the impossible maze of trees that had swallowed my escape route. And when I looked back, he was gone. But in the soft earth where he'd stood, there was something new. A single word, pressed into the ground as if by invisible feet. Soon. Night fell without warning, like someone had thrown a switch. The woods turned black, not the gentle darkness of evening, but an absolute void that swallowed my flashlight beam after mere inches. I stumbled forward, guided only by the faint phosphorescence of something that might have been fox fire or might have been something worse, until I found it, an old cabin, overgrown and sunken into the hillside like it had tried to hide itself from whatever walked these woods. The structure was wrong. Built from logs that were too straight, too uniform, fitted together with joints that seemed to flow rather than connect. The roof sagged under the weight of moss and something that looked like hair. The door was cracked open, hanging on rusted hinges that should have squealed but made no sound. Inside, candles, still burning, though their wax had never dripped. No wind, no sound, just dust motes dancing in the yellow light and the overwhelming smell of something sweet and rotten. On the table, a journal bound in leather that felt warm to the touch. I flipped through with trembling fingers. Pages and pages of one repeated phrase, written in different hands, different inks, spanning what looked like decades. He walks behind me. He walks behind me. He walks behind me. The handwriting changed from page to page, sometimes neat cursive, sometimes desperate scrawl, sometimes letters carved so deep they'd torn through the paper. Until the last page. I turn around. The page was soaked in something dark that had never quite dried, staining the paper the color of old blood. I dropped the book, and it fell open to a page I hadn't seen before. Fresh ink. My handwriting. You're reading this. I had never touched a pen in that cabin. And then I heard it. A step. Right outside the door. Deliberate. Heavy. Like boots filled with stones. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Pressed myself against the far wall, feeling splinters dig into my palms. Then a whisper from outside the window, or maybe from inside my own skull. A voice made of leaves rustling and branches breaking, and the sound wind makes when it's trying to form words. If you see his face, you become his face. The candles flickered but didn't die. In their dancing light, I saw something that made my knees buckle. Scratched into the cabin wall, invisible until the shadows shifted. A list of names. Dozens of them. Park rangers who had gone missing over the decades. Coates was there, though he wouldn't disappear for another week. And at the bottom, in letters that seemed to pulse with their own dark light, my name, my badge number, today's date. I bolted, ran through the woods like a madman, crashing through underbrush that seemed to grab at my ankles, dodged between trees that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Branches sliced my arms. Thorns ripped my shirt. Roots rose up to trip me. And behind me, always behind me, the sound of steady footsteps that never seemed to get closer but never fell behind. I don't know how long I ran. Hours. Maybe days. Time had no meaning in that place where the shadows walked backward. Eventually, I collapsed at the base of a tree whose bark was carved with a single word. Exit. When I woke, I was at the edge of Shattered Creek Trail, a legitimate hiking path I'd walked 100 times. No unmarked trail behind me. No cabin. No man. Just cold wind and an overwhelming sense that I had barely escaped something that still watched me from the tree line. Back at Devil's Throat Station, I tried to report it. Filled out forms. Drew maps. Described everything in detail. They told me I'd had a stress episode. Too much isolation. Too many late shifts. Too much time in mountains that drove men mad if they stayed too long. They suggested counseling. Maybe a transfer to a station with more people, more activity. But a week later, a ranger named Coates went missing. Last seen near the Morning Hollow clearing. I checked his route on the duty board. Right past the unmarked clearing. I filed a request to search the Bone Ridge Wilderness. It was denied. Dangerous terrain. Unstable ground. Not worth the risk for one missing person. So I went myself. Found the clearing. Found the path again, waiting for me like an old friend. And on the tree, etched fresh in bark that still wept sap, 2025. Below it, in letters that seemed to have been burned rather than carved. He walks with U.S. now. I never found Coates, but I keep dreaming of the faceless man. He walks just ahead of me through landscapes that exist only in the spaces between sleeping and waking, always turning corners I can't reach, always disappearing around bends that shouldn't exist. And when I wake, my boots are dirty, covered in soil that doesn't match anything near my cabin. Pine needles that don't grow in this part of the mountains. Like I've been walking. Like I've been following. Sometimes I find myself standing in my window in the middle of the night, staring out at the whispering bone peaks, and I swear I can see a figure in ranger green moving between the trees, waiting, watching. And sometimes, just as sleep pulls me under, I hear the voice again, not from outside, but from inside my own throat. You're next. The worst part isn't the dreams or the dirt on my boots, or even the growing certainty that something impossible is hunting me through forests that shouldn't exist. The worst part is the journal I found on my kitchen table this morning. Leather-bound, warm to the touch. The first page written in my handwriting. There's a trail out in the Whispering Bone Mountains they don't mark on the map. You learn to filter out forest sounds when you're a ranger. Birds, crickets, wind, animal calls, the rustle of leaves against leaves, the distant crack of settling timber, the soft scurry of nocturnal creatures through undergrowth. After years in the service, these sounds become as familiar as your own heartbeat, a symphony of wilderness that lulls you into the rhythm of nature's pulse. But what you never expect, what you're never trained for, is hearing a child crying where there shouldn't be any children. Especially not at 2 a.m., when even the owls have gone silent and the air hangs thick with that peculiar stillness that comes just before dawn's first breath. Especially not in the heart of the Thornwood Wastes, a zone closed to the public for over 15 years due to unexplained disappearances. 7 hikers, 3 campers, 2 researchers from the state university, all vanished without a trace, leaving behind only abandoned campsites and the lingering sense that something in these woods was fundamentally wrong. But that's where I was stationed. And that's what I heard. A little girl, crying, sobbing with the raw desperation of someone who has been calling for help until their voice cracked, until hope itself began to fracture. Alone. And just beyond the tree line, where the shadows seemed to pool and writhe like living things. The assignment. They called it a temporary post. Said it was just routine fire watch duty. Nothing unusual about it, just keeping an eye on the dry season, monitoring for smoke, filing daily reports that nobody would probably ever read. But the tone in my supervisor's voice was different. Forced. Like he was reading from a script someone had placed in front of him at gunpoint. The words came out too measured, too practiced, and when I asked about the history of the area, he'd gone quiet for a long moment before changing the subject entirely. I should have backed out then. Should have listened to the voice in my gut that whispered this wasn't right. But the money was good. Hazard pay, they called it, though they wouldn't specify what the hazard was. The isolation. Even better. I like being alone. Had always preferred the company of trees to people, found peace in the vast silence of untouched wilderness. After my divorce, after the bitter custody battle that left me seeing my daughter every other weekend, solitude felt like medicine. At least, I used to. The station itself was small. One-room hut on stilts, 30 feet in the air, surrounded by pine, so dense you couldn't see more than 15 feet in any direction without binoculars. The trees pressed in like curious giants, their branches occasionally scraping against the walls when the wind picked up, creating sounds that made you think something was trying to get in. The hut smelled of cedar and old fear, a scent I couldn't identify at first, but that seemed to seep from the very wood itself. Previous rangers had left their marks, initials carved into windowsills, coffee stains on a desk, a pile of paperback novels with pages so dog-eared they looked like they'd been read obsessively. And there was one more thing. A tree in the clearing below. Massive, black-barked, twisted like it had grown screaming, its trunk bulging and contorting in ways that defied nature's usual symmetry. The bark was scarred with deep grooves that formed patterns, almost like faces if you looked at them long enough. Almost like children's faces, mouths open in silent screams. Locals called it the Weeping Widow. They said it wept blood. They said it was older than the settlement, older than memory itself, and that it had been crying since before the first white man set foot in these mountains. First night, I heard the crying again, right beneath the station, so close I could almost feel the sobs vibrating through the wooden stilts. Not a baby. Girl. Maybe 7 or 8, with that particular timbre that comes from a child who has been crying for so long that their voice has gone hoarse, broken down to raw emotion. High-pitched, shaky, desperate, like she'd been lost for days, wandering through these endless trees, calling for parents who would never answer. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned a clearing, the beam cutting through darkness so complete it seemed solid. The light revealed nothing but empty ground and the massive trunk of the Weeping Widow, its bark glistening wetly in the artificial illumination. Nothing, just the tree. But as the wind moved through the branches above, setting them to creaking like old ship timbers, I swear I saw something against the bark. Dark streaks that caught the light differently than the surrounding wood. Stains, dark red, thick, dripping down the side like tears, forming small pools at the base where the ground had turned black and soft, as if nothing would grow there. But it didn't come from a cut. It came from the center of the trunk, seeping through the bark like the tree itself was bleeding, like it was leaking life. Then the crying stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, an absolute quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums until I had to resist the urge to make noise just to break it. The journal. Day 3, I found a journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the radio equipment. The wood had warped over time, creating a gap just wide enough for someone to slide a small notebook inside. It was wrapped in plastic, protected from moisture, like whoever hid it knew it would need to survive. No name on the cover. Just entries going back years, written in different hands. Different rangers, I realized. All of them documenting the same things. The crying, the tree, the strange dreams that came with prolonged exposure to this place. Most entries ended abruptly, sentences cutting off mid-word as if the writer had simply vanished while putting pen to paper. Some were unreadable, the handwriting degrading into frantic scrawls that looked more like claw marks than letters. But one stood out, written in careful block letters as if the author was fighting to maintain control. She cries when she's lonely. She cries when she's hungry. The sound travels through the roots, through the wood itself. Don't go near the tree after sunset. Don't let her see your face clearly. And whatever you do, never say your name out loud. Names have power here. They're how she finds you, how she calls you home. I read it 3 times, each pass making my hand shake a little more. Then I heard the crying again. Only this time, it was inside the station, coming from the walls themselves, as if the sound was traveling through the grain of the wood like electricity through wire. The shadow. I spun, heart hammering against my ribs hard enough to bruise. Nothing there. But the crying didn't stop. It echoed through the walls, impossible acoustics that made the small space feel vast and hollow, like the sound was moving through the wood itself, following pathways I couldn't see or understand. The crying grew closer, more distinct, until I could hear the individual hitches in breath, the wet sound of tears on young cheeks. Then the door creaked open. Just a crack. Enough to let in a sliver of moonlight and something else. And I saw her. A silhouette. Small. Frail. Face hidden behind long dark hair that seemed to move with its own wind. Standing at the base of the weeping widow, perfectly still in a way that no living child should be able to maintain. Not moving. Not breathing. Just pointing at me. Her arm extended in my direction like an accusation, like a judgment, and even though I couldn't see her eyes through the curtain of hair, I felt them on me. Felt them burning into my skin with an intensity that made my teeth ache. Then she opened her mouth and screamed. Not the broken sob of a lost child, but something else entirely. Something that sounded like wind through a cave, like the death cry of something that had never been human to begin with. The sound shattered the night, sent every creature in the forest fleeing, and when it finally ended, the silence that followed was so complete I wondered if I'd gone deaf. The dreams. After that night, I stopped sleeping. When I closed my eyes, I saw the tree, twisting, growing taller with each blink, its branches reaching into the clouds like grasping fingers, growing wider, its trunk expanding until it filled my entire field of vision, the bark shifting and writhing like living skin. Its branches turned into arms, thin, childlike arms that beckoned and grasped. Its bark split into a face, her face, though I still couldn't see it clearly in the waking world. The features were wrong, too sharp, too old for a child's face, with eyes that reflected starlight like pools of black water. And every time I ran in a dream, my feet sinking into earth that felt more like flesh with each step, the roots wrapped around my legs. Thick as anacondas, rough as rope, they dragged me back toward the trunk no matter how hard I fought. Every time I screamed, she'd whisper in a voice like autumn leaves, "Say your name." The words would echo in my skull long after I jerked awake, soaked in sweat and gasping like I'd been drowning. The ranger before me. On day 6, I received a box via supply drop. The pilot wouldn't even shut off his engine, just hovered long enough to lower the package on a cable before pulling away like the forest itself might reach up and drag him down. I watched the helicopter disappear beyond the ridge, its rotors beating a rhythm that sounded almost like crying. Inside the box, a tape recorder, some batteries, and a note written on Ranger Station letterhead. Play it when the crying starts. Don't listen alone. Don't listen in the dark. And don't listen all the way to the end. Sim. I recognized the initials. Charles Martin. He was the ranger stationed here before me, a 20-year veteran with commendations for search and rescue work throughout the region. A family man with 2 daughters of his own. He'd gone missing 18 months ago, presumed dead after they found his abandoned truck at the park entrance, keys still in the ignition, coffee still warm in the cup holder. I loaded the tape, hands trembling as I inserted the batteries. Press play. Crackling static filled the small space, punctuated by what sounded like breathing, quick, panicked respirations of someone trying not to make noise. Then his voice, so terrified and shaky, I almost didn't recognize it as belonging to a grown man. Day 14. If you're hearing this, she's already seen you. Already marked you. You can't leave. Not until she chooses someone else. Not until she gets what she wants. And if she asks your name, don't answer. Don't even think it too clearly. She'll take your voice first, then your memories, then your body, then your life. She's inside the tree, but she's also inside everything the roots touch, watching through the bark, listening through the earth, waiting to be let out, waiting for someone to speak their name and give her the key she needs. A long pause filled with that same labored breathing. She was a child once, a real child, lost in these woods so long ago that the forest itself forgot her name. But she remembered mine. God help me, she remembered mine. Then screaming, something pounding on wood with inhuman strength, splintering and cracking as if the very walls were being torn apart. Charles's voice raw with terror. I can see her face now. I can see what she really. Then a silence. Nothing but the soft hiss of empty tape. The burn attempt. I made a decision that night, sitting in the dark with the tape recorder clutched in my hands like a talisman. I was going to burn the tree down. I didn't care if it got me fired. I didn't care if it was illegal, if it violated every principle of forest conservation I'd sworn to uphold. I just wanted out. I just wanted the crying to stop. The next morning, I took every drop of gasoline from the generator reserves, every bottle of camping fuel from the emergency supplies, carried it all down to the base of the Weeping Widow in daylight, when the tree looked almost normal, just old and twisted, scarred by lightning and wind. That night, when the crying started again, I poured it all over the base of the massive trunk. The gasoline soaked into the bark like water into sand, disappearing into cracks and crevices that seemed to open specifically to drink it in. Lit a match. Tossed it. The fire caught fast, flames racing up the trunk in a spiral pattern that followed the deep grooves in the bark. The heat was immediate and intense, forcing me back until I was pressed against the base of the fire tower. But the tree didn't burn. It screamed. Like a woman in agony, like every mother who had ever lost a child, the sound tore through the night with such force that windows shattered in the station above. I fell back, covering my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my own skull. Blood poured from the seams in the trunk. Not sap, not resin. Blood. Thick and dark and warm, it soaked into the earth around the base of the tree and began to form patterns, letters, words that glowed in the firelight. Say your name. The flames guttered and died as if snuffed by invisible hands, leaving the tree unmarked, unburned, still weeping its crimson tears. The storm. Lightning hit Dead Man's Ridge that night, a bolt so massive it lit up the entire valley for several seconds and left the smell of ozone thick in the air. The power went out with a pop and a shower of sparks from the generator. I tried the radio, dead static. Tried the emergency beacon. Wouldn't even blink. Tried my cell phone, knowing it was useless this deep in the mountains, but desperate enough to check anyway. No signal. No bars. The screen flickered and went dark, as if the device itself had given up. Then the crying returned. Not outside this time. Inside. Under the floorboards, directly beneath my feet. I dropped to my knees on the rough wooden planks, put my ear to the gaps between the boards, and listened to what sounded like dozens of voices, children's voices, all crying at once, their sobs harmonizing into something that was almost musical, almost beautiful, if you could ignore the desperation that laced every note. A whisper rose from the chorus, distinct and clear. I'm under your skin now. And then the boards cracked. Something reached through, not breaking the wood, but seeming to phase through it like it was made of mist. A hand, black as charcoal. Fingers long and thin as twigs, with nails that looked more like thorns. Bleeding from wounds that never healed. Reaching for my throat with the slow, inexorable movement of growing roots. The final choice. I ran. Didn't take gear, didn't grab supplies, didn't even stop to put on shoes. Didn't look back as I crashed through the door and down the ladder, splinters from the rungs tearing into my palms. Ran through the woods in bare feet, branches whipping at my face, roots catching at my ankles like they were trying to trip me. The crying followed me, not just from behind, but from all sides, as if every tree in the forest had taken up the lament. The sound grew louder with each step, more insistent, until it drowned out even the thunder of my own heartbeat. At some point, could have been minutes, could have been hours, my legs gave out. I collapsed face first into a carpet of rotting leaves, my lungs burning, my throat raw from gasping the thin mountain air. The last thing I remembered was the crying fading to a whisper, and then to nothing at all. I woke in a hospital bed in Millbrook General, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. 2 weeks later, they told me. Found wandering near the park entrance in nothing but underwear and a torn undershirt. Dehydrated. Malnourished. Raving about trees and crying children and names that shouldn't be spoken aloud. I asked about the station. About the weeping widow. About Charles Martin and the journal and the tape recording. They told me there was no tree like that in the clearing. No cabin on stilts. No ranger assigned to the Thornwood Wastes in over a year. The area had been closed since the disappearances, they said. Too dangerous. Too many people gone missing without explanation. They showed me the map, pointing to the section with thick red lines drawn around it. The entire area was marked. Closed, unstable terrain, no access. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd almost become. Epilogue. Sometimes when I'm alone at night in my new apartment in the city, far from any forest, surrounded by concrete and steel and the constant hum of civilization, I still hear the crying. It starts as a whisper at the edge of hearing, then grows until it fills the room, echoing off the walls like it's coming from inside them. Sometimes I dream of roots growing beneath my skin, threading through my veins like dark ivy, connecting me to something vast and hungry that waits in the deepest part of the woods. Sometimes I wake up whispering my name over and over, the syllables feeling foreign on my tongue, like someone's trying to make me forget it. Like something is slowly stealing the words that make me who I am. And in my worst nightmares, the ones that feel more like memories than dreams, I always wake under the tree, face pressed to bleeding bark that pulses like a heartbeat, roots wrapped around my wrists like shackles, and a voice behind me, sweet as a child's lullaby, saying, "You answered." But the thing is, and this is what keeps me awake most nights, what has me checking locks and windows and sleeping with every light in the apartment burning, I never remember answering. I never remember saying my name, which means either I'm losing my mind, or she's still calling, still waiting, still crying in the dark places between the trees. And somewhere in the deepest part of myself that I try not to acknowledge, I can feel something responding to that call. Something that wants to walk back into those woods. Something that wants to go home.